The last stagecoach of the season left Nell Porter standing at a crossroads in the middle of Wyoming with nothing but a carpet bag, a contract she had signed in good faith, and the growing certainty that she had made a terrible mistake. Not the kind of mistake you could undo with an apology or a train ticket east. The kind that settles into your bones like cold water and stays there. It was the 23rd of November, 1894. The sky above the Wyoming Territory had turned the color of old pewter sometime around midday, and by the time the stagecoach driver pulled his team to a stop at the crossroads and announced that this was as far as he was going, the first snowflakes were already falling. Fat, lazy flakes that drifted down with the unhurried confidence of something that had nowhere else to be. Nell stood and watched the coach disappear back the way it had come. She watched it until the sound of the horses faded and the gray curtain of falling snow swallowed it whole. Then she picked up her carpet bag, adjusted the weight of it in her right hand, and looked north along the wagon road that was supposed to take her the remaining 10 miles to the Ashworth Ranch. 10 miles. She had walked 10 miles before in her life. Along the cobblestones of Philadelphia from her boarding house on Chestnut Street, down to the docks and back again, counting the blocks to make the miles. 10 miles on flat city ground was an afternoon. 10 miles on a frozen Wyoming wagon road with a storm coming in from the mountains was something else entirely. She started walking anyway, because there was nothing else to do. Nell Porter was 24 years old, educated well beyond what most people considered necessary for a woman of her station, and possessed of a particular stubbornness that her mother had always called a character flaw, and her father had always called the only thing keeping the family from complete ruin. She had grown up in a narrow townhouse on the wrong side of a respectable neighborhood, the daughter of a school teacher who drank and a seamstress who worked herself hollow to make up the difference. She had learned early that the world did not offer soft landings to women who waited around hoping for them. So she had answered the advertisement. It had appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer on a Tuesday morning in September, tucked between the notices for dry goods and the announcements of land sales out west. A rancher in Wyoming Territory seeking a wife of good character and reasonable education. Room board and a life of honest purpose provided. Interested parties to write to a solicitor's office in Cheyenne. She had written that same afternoon. The correspondence that followed was formal and efficient. There was no romance in it, no pretense of courtship. A Mr. Hargreaves at the solicitor's office sent her a contract written in careful legal language. She read it 3 times, made note of the clauses she did not entirely understand, and signed her name at the bottom in the clear, even hand she had learned from her father before the drinking had gotten bad enough to make him forget she existed. The contract specified her arrival date, her duties as wife to one Rutherford Ashworth of the Ashworth Ranch in Lander County, and various other terms that she told herself were simply the practical language of a practical arrangement. She did not think too carefully about what it meant to be a woman who had signed a contract. She thought instead about what it meant to be a woman who had a plan. The snow was falling harder now. What had started as gentle flurries was thickening into something with real weight behind it. The wind had picked up from the northwest, finding the gaps between her coat buttons, slipping cold fingers along the back of her neck. The wagon road was still visible under about an inch of fresh snow, but the edges of it were blurring fast the surrounding prairie, erasing itself in slow increments until there was only white in every direction. Nell kept walking. She thought about the women she had grown up watching. Her mother at the sewing machine at midnight, eyes red from the lamplight, fingers moving on their own, while the rest of her was somewhere far away. The women in church on Sundays wearing their best dresses to sit in pews and be grateful for lives that had been chosen for them before they were old enough to understand that choices existed at all. The girls she had gone to school with one by one, finding husbands and disappearing into houses and coming out again a few years later, looking like someone had quietly removed something essential from inside them. She was not going to be that. Whatever Rutherford Ashworth turned out to be, whatever the Ashworth Ranch turned out to look like, she was going to find a way to be something more than furniture. That was the thought she was holding on to when the wind hit her properly for the first time. It came across the open prairie from the northwest, like something that had been building strength for 1,000 miles and had finally found something worth hitting. It staggered her sideways, knocked the breath out of her lungs, sent her carpet bag swinging hard against her hip. The snow that had been falling vertically was suddenly horizontal, driving into her face like needles collecting in her eyelashes, filling her mouth when she opened it to gasp. The wagon road disappeared. Not gradually, all at once. One moment there was a visible track in the snow ahead of her, a slight depression in the white, the ghost of wagon wheel ruts. The next moment there was nothing. Just white in every direction, white overhead, white underfoot, white pressing in from all sides until she could not tell with any certainty which way was north. Which was the road, which was the open prairie, falling away toward the creek, she had been told ran about 200 yards west of the road. She stopped walking, because walking in a direction you could not identify was worse than not walking at all. The cold had gotten past her coat, past her wool dress and her cotton underthings, and whatever small warmth her body was still generating. It was inside her now, settling into her chest, climbing up the back of her neck. Her fingers had gone from cold to numb sometime in the last 10 minutes. Her feet inside her good traveling boots were starting to feel like objects that belonged to someone else, things she was carrying rather than things that were part of her. She understood in a way that was almost calm in its clarity that she was in serious danger. And then she saw the light, just a faint amber smudge in the white, maybe 50 yards to her left, maybe 100 distance, being impossible to judge in a whiteout. It could have been anything: a homestead, a line shack, a trick of a snow-blind mind looking for something to fix onto. But it was the only thing in the entire white world that suggested the possibility of surviving the next hour. So Nell picked up her carpet bag, put her head down against the wind, and moved toward it. The snow was knee-deep in the drifts she had to push through. The wind came at her in gusts that stopped her cold and then eased just enough to let her take another few steps before hitting again. She counted her steps the way she had counted city blocks as a girl. 1, 2, 3, 4. Keep counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Do not think about the cold. Do not think about what happens if the light disappears. The light did not disappear. It grew. Resolved itself from a smudge into a glow, from a glow into the warm yellow square of a window. Then she could see the shape of a building low against the hillside, half buried in drifted snow smoke, rising straight up from a stone chimney for about 2 feet before the wind grabbed it and tore it sideways. There were snowshoes hanging from wooden pegs beside the front door. Animal hides stretched on wooden frames along the eastern wall, their pale undersides facing outward in the thin light. A lean-to shelter where she could hear horses moving restlessly and the occasional sound of a hoof striking frozen ground. She stumbled the last 20 feet and hit the door with her fist. It opened almost immediately, like someone had been watching the window and seen her coming. The man who opened it was tall enough that he blocked most of the light from the room behind him. Broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who had spent years doing work that required it. Dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of a worn flannel shirt. A jawline that carried several days of dark stubble. He was wearing the kind of expression that belongs to a person who has seen difficult things and learned to assess new information quickly and without visible alarm. He looked at Nell, then he looked past her at the blizzard, then he looked back at her face. Whatever he saw there was apparently sufficient. He reached out, took her carpet bag from her hand without asking, and pulled her through the doorway. The heat from the fireplace hit her like a wall. After the absolute cold outside, it was almost painful, her skin screaming at the sudden change in temperature, her eyes watering. She stood just inside the door and shook great full-body shudders she could not control, her teeth chattering, hard enough to hurt her hands trembling, even as she pressed them together. The man had already shut the door against the wind. He set her carpet bag down with a carefulness that suggested he understood it contained everything she had brought with her into this situation. The cabin was a single room, maybe 20 feet across. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a fire burning hot and orange in it. Rough wooden bunks were built into 2 corners. A table with 4 chairs sat in the center. Shelves lined with canned goods, coils of rope, leather harness, ammunition, and tools covered most of the wall opposite the fireplace. Furs were everywhere, beaver and fox and wolf, hanging from pegs stacked in the corners, draped over the ends of bunks. The whole place smelled of wood smoke and cured leather and coffee. 3 coats hung on iron pegs near the door. They were heavy canvas, worn at the elbows and cuffs, and each one had a small metal badge pressed into the left breast. A simple stamped circle bearing the words Ashworth Ranch, in raised letters, the kind of mark that spoke not of pride but of ownership. The badge of a man who considered the people working under his name an extension of his property. Nell noted it, filed it away, said nothing. 2 more men sat at the table. Both had turned to look at her when the door opened with the careful stillness of people who assess first and react second. The younger of the two was perhaps 27, lean and long-limbed, with sandy hair that needed cutting, and the kind of easy open face that suggests a person who has never found dishonesty worth the effort. He was rolling a cigarette with one hand and had stopped mid-motion when she walked in, tobacco and paper forgotten. The older man was closer to 40, with gray beginning at his temples and working its way through close-cropped brown hair. He had the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now something better, interesting, lived in, carrying the evidence of a great many decisions made in difficult circumstances. His hands resting on the table bore a stillness that belonged either to very patient people or to very dangerous ones. Sometimes both. Neither man spoke. They simply looked. The tall man who had opened the door crouched in front of her without asking permission, wrapped both hands around her numb fingers, and began to work heat back into them with a directness that was completely unsentimental and entirely effective. She found out his name a moment later when the older man at the table spoke. Holt, the older man said with the measured voice of someone choosing words carefully. Get her to the fire first. The tall man, Holt, nodded once without looking up from her hands. Cade, the older man, continued, turning to the younger one. Coffee. The good stuff. The younger man, Cade, was already on his feet. That left the older man himself, who rose from the table and moved the chair nearest the fireplace several inches closer to the heat, then stepped back in the way of someone who understands that a frightened woman does not need a man standing over her. He said, I am Harlan Price. The gentleman thawing out your hands is Holt Danner. The one burning the coffee is Cade Calloway. We are glad you found us when you did. His voice had a precision to it, the kind that comes from years of choosing words for their accuracy rather than their warmth. But there was warmth in it underneath the way there can be warmth in a very well-built house, where the heat is doing its work quietly and without announcement. Nell tried to say her name and produced mostly chattering teeth in a sound that might have been the end. It does not matter right now, Harlan said. Sit down. Holt guided her to the chair by the fire with one hand briefly at her elbow, then stepped back. She sat down. The heat from the fireplace came off the stones in waves pressing against her wet coat, beginning the slow work of reclaiming the cold that had settled into her. She pressed her hands toward the flame and watched them shake. Cade appeared at her shoulder with a tin cup. The coffee inside it was black and strong and hot enough that the steam rose in a visible column. She wrapped both hands around it and held it without drinking for a long moment, using it like a heater, feeling the warmth move from the metal into her palms and then slowly up her arms. She drank. It was the best thing she had ever tasted in her life. The three men arranged themselves around the cabin with a casualness that she would come to understand was not actually casual at all, but was instead the practiced spatial arrangement of people who have shared close quarters for a long time and know exactly how to give each other room without crowding the newcomer. Holt went back to something he had been working on at the far end of the table, a length of leather harness he was repairing with an awl and heavy thread. Cade settled near the fire with his coffee, not looking at her directly, but not pretending she was not there either. Harlan returned to his chair, folded his hands on the table, and said nothing. Nell's teeth stopped chattering somewhere around the third cup of coffee. She said, I am Nell Porter, from Philadelphia. I was on the stagecoach to Lander County. Holt said the stagecoach left you at the crossroads in this weather. It was not quite a question. He said it with the tone of a man confirming information he had already processed and filed away. The driver said it was as far as he would go. Nell said, he was right about that, Cade said from near the fire. His voice carried the soft drawl of someone raised in the deep South, Georgia maybe, or Alabama. These mountain storms do not give you a second chance to reconsider your choices. How far did you walk? Holt asked. She thought about it. 2 miles, perhaps a little more. I could not see the road after the first mile. Holt looked at her steadily for a moment. Something moved through his expression, not quite admiration, more like the recalibration that happens when a person turns out to be different from their initial impression. He said nothing about it. He returned to the harness in his hands. The storm continued its assault on the cabin walls. The wind found every gap and crack in the log construction and pushed through them with a sound like something alive and displeased. Outside, the horses in the lean-to shifted and stamped. The fire popped. The oil lamp on the table threw warm yellow light across the rough pine boards of the ceiling. Nell sat in the chair nearest the fire and let the warmth have its way with her. She thought about the 10 miles still between her and the Ashworth Ranch, about the contract in her carpet bag folded into the inside pocket of the leather document case her father had given her the morning she left, along with $20 in coin, and the expression of a man who is proud of his daughter and ashamed of the circumstances that have made her independence necessary. She thought about Rutherford Ashworth, whom she had never met, whose handwriting she had seen only in the brief formal note that had accompanied the signed contract, a note that said nothing beyond the date of expected arrival and the name of the nearest settlement where she could make inquiries if the stagecoach proved unreliable. She had thought, reading that note, that the brevity of it was simply the economy of a practical man. She was less certain of that now. She glanced again at the 3 coats hanging near the door. The badges, Ashworth Ranch, small and stamped and indifferent the way a brand mark on cattle is indifferent. She looked away before any of the men could catch her looking. She slept in the chair without meaning to. One moment she was watching the fire and listening to the quiet sounds of the 3 men going about their evening, the low exchange of words she could not quite make out, the scrape of a chair, the sound of cards being shuffled, and the next moment she was somewhere deep and dark and warm, and then Holt's voice was saying her name quietly close enough that she came awake without alarm. He had moved the nearest bunk. Not actually moved it because it was built into the wall, but he had put fresh blankets on it, the wool kind that smelled of cedar and cold air, and there was a wool sock warming near the fire that he indicated with a slight tilt of his head, meaning for her wet boots once she had dried them out. "Your bunk is there," he said. "We will be up another hour or so. Pay us no mind. She said you are giving me your bunk." He said, "I am sleeping on the floor. It is not a hardship. I have done it before." Before she could argue, and she had intended to argue because the instinct against inconveniencing people ran deep in her, the reflex of a woman who had always been told she was one degree of trouble away from being too much. He had already turned back to the table and resumed whatever conversation she had interrupted by waking up. She lay down in the bunk with her boots drying by the fire and the wool blankets pulled up to her chin, and she listened to the storm and the low voices of the men and the fire settling into its evening rhythm, and she fell into the deepest sleep she had had in months. In the morning, the storm was worse. Nell woke to the sound of an axe striking ice, steady, rhythmic blows from somewhere close to the door. The windows on the north wall were completely blocked by drifted snow. The fire had burned down to coals, and Cade was on his knees in front of it, feeding it split wood with the focused attention of someone who understood that fire in a Wyoming blizzard was not a comfort, but a necessity. She dressed quickly behind the privacy of a wool blanket someone had strung on a length of rope across the corner of her bunk. It was not much of a partition. She could see the shapes of the room through the weave of it, but the gesture of it was something. The acknowledgement that she deserved some small portion of privacy, even in a single room with 3 strangers. She noted it the way she had noted the badges on the coats the night before, filed it alongside everything else she was collecting about these men and their arrangement. When she came around the blanket, Harlan was sitting at the table with the tin cup, looking at nothing in the middle distance, the way men look when they are thinking through something complex and prefer to do it quietly. He said good morning without looking up. She said good morning back. Outside, the axe kept striking ice. She said, "Is that Holt?" Harlan said the door freezes shut in these temperatures. "He does it every morning. He will be in directly." She looked at the north window, completely white. She said, "How long do these storms last?" Harlan looked up at her then. He had pale gray eyes, the kind that give nothing away but miss nothing either. He said, "This one, 3 days minimum. Could be 5. She sat down across from him. She said, "I have a contract with the Ashworth Ranch." He said, "I know." She said, "You know my name." He said, "We were sent to the crossroads to collect you. The stagecoach was due 2 days ago. We have been waiting at the crossroads camp since Thursday. When the storm hit yesterday afternoon, we rode for this cabin. We did not know you were on the late stage." Something in the way he said this, the flatness of it, the absence of anything that sounded like enthusiasm, made Nell go quiet for a moment. She said, "You work for Rutherford Ashworth." Harlan said, "We do." She said, "All 3 of you." He said, "All 3 of us." Outside, the axe struck ice 4 more times. Then there was the sound of a door being forced against its frozen frame, the burst of cold air, the thud of it closing again. Holt came in, stamping snow from his boots, his coat white with it, his breath coming in visible clouds that dissipated slowly in the warmer air of the cabin. He pulled the coat off and hung it on its peg near the door. The badge on the breast caught the firelight for a moment before going dark again. He turned to the room, saw Nell sitting across from Harlan, saw whatever was in her expression, and went still for just a fraction of a second. He said, "Miss Porter, you slept well." It was not quite a question. She said, "I did. Thank you for the bunk." He nodded, moved to the fire to warm his hands. The morning passed with the slowness of time in a small space with a large storm outside. Cade cooked breakfast with the easy competence of someone who had learned long ago that a man who can cook in difficult conditions is a man who survives them. Nell helped where she could, ignoring the slight hesitation from Cade when she stood and reached for the pan, making it clear by her posture and her directness that she was not the kind of woman who sat idle while others worked. After the breakfast plates had been cleared, she excused herself with the explanation that she needed to reorganize her traveling bag. She took it to her corner behind the wool blanket partition and sat on the edge of the bunk with it in her lap. She opened it, took stock of what was inside. Her spare dress, her toiletries in their small leather case, her document folder with the contract and the $20 and a letter of introduction she had composed herself because no one else was going to compose it for her. Her Bible, which she carried not out of particular devotion, but because it had been her mother's, and it was the right size to fill the gap in the bag where things shifted. She was not actually reorganizing the bag. She was thinking. 3 men sent to collect her, sent by Rutherford Ashworth, who had signed a contract calling her the future Mrs. Ashworth, but who had not found it worth his time to come collect her himself. 3 ranch hands who had been waiting at a crossroads camp in late November, Wyoming, who had ridden to this cabin when the storm hit, who had let her sleep in their bunk and warmed her hands and made her coffee and had not once not, in the entire evening and morning, spoken of Ashworth with anything resembling warmth. She thought about Harlan's gray eyes, the way they gave nothing away, the way he had said, "We work for Rutherford Ashworth," with all the enthusiasm of a man describing the weather. She thought about the badges on the coats, small metal discs that marked a man as belonging to something the same way a cattle brand marks an animal as belonging to something. She thought about the note from Ashworth, the solicitor, that had accompanied her contract, the careful legal language, the clauses she had not entirely understood. She needed a map. If she could get a clear picture of the terrain between here and Lander County, she could understand her options. Whether there was another route, whether there was a settlement between this cabin and the Ashworth Ranch, where she might find a boarding house, a telegraph office, someone to wire to. She had seen saddlebags near the door when she came in, the kind that would carry a man's working documents, maps, letters. Trail riders always kept maps. It was not a romantic notion about finding answers, just a practical one about knowing the geography of her situation. She waited until all 3 men were outside together. Holt had asked Cade and Harlan to help him shore up the lean-to south wall against the increasing wind, and then she moved quickly. The saddlebags near the door were stamped with the letters HD, burned into the leather, worn smooth from use. She opened the right side pocket, first found a folded length of cord and a small whetstone and a folding knife. She opened the left side. There was a map. She unfolded it quickly, saw the terrain she needed, noted the distances and the landmarks, began to fold it back. Beneath the map was a letter, folded once, the Ashworth Ranch seal pressed in wax on the outside. She should have put it back. She knew she should have put it back. She had been raised by a woman of principle who had always said that certain kinds of privacy were not to be violated. Her mother had also raised her to survive, and survival sometimes required information. She opened the letter. It was short, written in a cramped, precise hand that communicated impatience even in its penmanship. "Danner," it said, "the Philadelphia woman arrives on the late November coach. Ensure she is delivered to the ranch promptly and without incident. I am not in the habit of waiting. She is contracted. Ensure the contract is honored in full, and keep your hands where they belong. I am not paying for broken goods. Ashworth." Nell read the letter twice. She had never in her life been called goods before. She had been called difficult. She had been called willful. She had been called by a boy she had once thought she might have feelings for more trouble than you are worth. But she had not been called goods. She folded the letter precisely along its original crease, replaced it under the map, closed the saddlebag. She walked to her bunk and sat down. She sat very still for a long moment, her hands in her lap, the sound of the storm outside filling all the space in the cabin that the silence left. She was not going to cry. Crying was for situations where you had already exhausted every other option and she had not yet begun. What she was going to do was think, clearly, methodically, without panic. She was going to take stock of what she knew and what she did not know, and she was going to figure out what her actual options were. What she knew, she was trapped in a blizzard with 3 men in the employ of a man who considered her a contractual delivery. The storm would last at minimum 3 days, possibly 5. The nearest settlement was 10 miles north, which was also the direction of the Ashworth Ranch. She had $20 a signed contract and the legal knowledge that she was, as of this moment, still Nell Porter of Philadelphia, not yet the property of anyone. What she did not know what Rutherford Ashworth was actually like. What the terms of the contract actually meant in practice, whether these 3 men were the instruments of her delivery or something more complicated. That last question was the one that mattered most right now. And there was only one way to find out. The door opened, cold air and the smell of pine and snow. The 3 men came back inside, knocking ice from their boots, pulling off frozen gloves. Holt was the last one through. He pulled the door shut behind him and turned. He found Nell standing in the middle of the room watching him. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not alarm, not guilt. The slight recalibration of a man who is used to reading situations accurately and has just read something new. He said nothing. He crossed to the fire and held his hands out to it. Nell said, "Mr. Danner." He turned his head. She said, "I have a question and I would like an honest answer." He looked at her steadily, said nothing but did not look away. She said, "You were sent to collect me and deliver me to the Ashworth Ranch." He said, "Yes." She said, "You know Rutherford Ashworth. You work for him. You know what kind of man he is." He said nothing, but the quality of his silence was its own kind of answer. She said, "Are you going to deliver me?" The fire crackled. Kate had gone very still near the shelves where he was pretending to organize something. Harlan at the table had not moved. The storm pressed against the walls. Holt Danner looked at Nell Porter for a long moment. His expression was unreadable in the way of men who have made a practice of keeping it so. But his hands held toward the fire were very still. He did not answer. And somehow, standing in that cabin in the middle of the worst storm she had ever seen in her life, with $20 in her pocket and a contract that called her goods and 3 strangers as her only company, Nell found that the silence was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in weeks. The second day began the way difficult days often do, quietly, with the false gentleness of a situation that has not yet decided how bad it intends to get. Nell woke before the others. The fire had burned low in the night, and the cabin held the cold of early morning, that thin, penetrating cold that settles into a room in the hours before dawn, when even the walls seem to have given up on warmth. She lay still for a moment under the wool blankets and listened. The storm outside had not quit. It had changed character overnight. The violent gusting of the previous evening had settled into something steadier, more patient, a sustained howl that suggested it was in no hurry to conclude its business with the Wyoming territory. She got up, found the split wood stacked beside the fireplace, and added 3 pieces to the coals the way she had watched Cade do it the evening before, not piling them, but placing them with space between, letting the air do its work. The fire caught. She fed it again. By the time the first gray light was pushing against the snow-blocked windows, the room had regained something resembling warmth. She was at the table with coffee when Holt came down from his bunk. He stopped when he saw the fire, looked at the fire, then at her, then at the coffee pot. He said, "You built that up." She said it needed doing. He looked at her for another moment with that steady, assessing quality that she was beginning to understand was simply the way he engaged with the world. Not suspicion, not calculation, just the careful attention of a man who had learned that most problems looked at directly and honestly turn out to be clearer than they first appeared. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. They sat in silence for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It had the quality of 2 people who have each independently decided that conversation requires something worth saying and are content to wait until that condition is met. Outside, the storm pressed on. Nell said, "How long have you worked for Ashworth?" Holt turned his cup in his hands. Said, "3 seasons, going on 4. She said, "And before that," he said, "before that I worked for a cattle operation up near the Montana line. Before that, I drove horses out of Texas up the Chisholm. Before that, I was 17 years old and doing whatever a 17-year-old does when he has no particular plan and a strong preference for open country over rooftops. He said it with no self-consciousness and no apology. Simply the facts of a life laid out with the same directness he applied to everything else. She said, "Do you like it at the work?" He thought about it. Not the performative pause of a man deciding what answer will make him sound best, but the genuine pause of a man who does not give answers he has not actually considered. He said, "I like the country. I like the horses. I like work that has a clear result you can see at the end of the day. Whether the man whose name is on the payroll is worth working for, that is a separate question." He did not say anything else about it. He did not need to. Kate appeared sometime later, hair standing in four directions, squinting at the light from the fire, with the expression of someone who is not naturally an early riser, but has made his peace with the necessity of being one. He took over the cooking without ceremony, moving around the limited space of the cabin with the practiced economy of a man who had learned to make good food in difficult conditions and considered this a point of professional pride. He made cornmeal porridge with dried fruit and fatback coffee, thick enough to eat with a spoon, and a rough biscuit cooked in the iron pan that came out uneven on the outside and improbably good on the inside. He did all of this while carrying on a meandering, one-sided conversation about the relative merits of different kinds of cast iron pans, their proper seasoning, the criminal negligence of people who wash them with soap. Nell listened. After a while, she got up and stood beside him and watched what he was doing with the pan. She said, "Show me how you do the biscuits." He looked at her sideways. "Said you cook?" She said, "I cook well enough to keep myself alive. I do not cook well enough to make it worth doing." "There is a difference," he laughed. A genuine open sound that filled the whole cabin and seemed to surprise him as much as anyone. He said, "That is the most honest thing I have heard about cooking since my grandmother told me that her secret ingredient was not caring what anyone thought about it." He showed her the biscuits. The ratio of flour to fat, the minimal handling, the way you could tell by the sound of the sizzle whether the pan was at the right temperature. His hands moved with a gentle precision as he demonstrated, and Nell understood that Cade Calloway was a man who expressed through action what he could not always find words for care attention. The quiet intention to make something better than it strictly needed to be. Harlan ate breakfast without speaking much, which seemed to be his natural state in the morning. He had the look of a man with a great deal going on in the upper floors, while the ground floor attended to the business of coffee and cornmeal. After breakfast, when the dishes had been cleaned and stacked, and the fire had settled into its working rhythm, Holt pulled on his coat and looked at Nell. He said, "Come outside." She said, "It is a blizzard." He said, "I know. Get your coat." She got her coat. Outside, the world was entirely white and entirely loud. The wind grabbed at her from the moment she stepped through the door, pushing her sideways, filling her ears with a sustained roar that made conversation require a certain effort. The snow had drifted to the roof of the lean-to on the north side. To the south, where the hillside broke some of the wind's force, it was somewhat more navigable. Holt stood in the lee of the cabin wall, one shoulder against the logs, looking at the sky. He said, "What do you see?" She said, "Snow, wind, more snow." He said, "Look at the color of the sky to the northwest." She looked. She said, "It is lighter there than directly overhead." He said, "That means the worst of the system is to the east and moving. When the front edge of a storm like this passes the sky to the northwest, lightens first. You will not see it clearly for another day, maybe two. But it is there." He said, "Now, look at the snow coming off the roof of the lean-to." She looked. The snow was blowing off the roof in a thin horizontal sheet streaming out to the southeast. He said, "That tells you wind direction and intensity. When that stream starts to break up and fall more vertically, the wind is losing strength. When it falls straight down, the storm is ending." She said, "You read the storm like a map." He said, "Everything has a map if you learn how to read it. Sky, ground, snow, the way an animal moves when it is frightened versus when it is simply alert. The way a man holds his shoulders when he is telling you the truth versus when he is telling you what he thinks you want to hear." He said that last part without looking at her. His eyes were still on the sky to the northwest. She said, "And what do my shoulders tell you right now?" He looked at her then. He said, "They tell me you are not as afraid as you probably ought to be, and that you are thinking harder than you are letting on." She said, "Is that a problem?" He said, "No." He said it with something in his voice that was not quite a smile but occupied the same general territory. They went back inside. He showed her the tracks in the snow near the lean-to, the difference between the pressed oval of a deer hoof and the dragging shuffle of a much larger animal. He showed her how fresh snow on top of a track indicated the time elapsed since it was made, and how the crystalline structure of the snow itself changed with temperature in ways that told you how cold it had gotten overnight. He taught her these things with the calm directness of someone passing on knowledge that had been hard-won and was worth having, regardless of whether she ever found herself in a position to use it. She listened carefully and asked good questions. He answered the good questions with the respect they deserved. The third day was colder. The temperature dropped in the night and stayed low, and the ice on the inside of the north windows was thick enough to be structural. Holt had to use the axe on the door twice morning and evening to break the ice that kept reforming around its frame. Inside, the four of them had found something like a rhythm. It was not comfort, exactly, the cabin was too small, and their circumstances too strange for real comfort, but it was functional. They had learned the dimensions of each other's habits and requirements. Cade needed quiet in the morning for about 20 minutes and was perfectly agreeable after that. Harlan worked through his thinking in silence and emerged from it when he emerged with a precision of language that suggested the silence had been doing useful work. Holt moved through the space with an economy that took up no more room than it needed to, which in a 20-foot cabin with 4 people was a genuine skill. Nell had made herself useful everywhere she could because it was her nature and because the alternative was sitting still with her thoughts, and her thoughts had a quality she preferred not to spend too much time in. She organized the supply shelves with a system that made Harlan raise one eyebrow in something that might have been appreciation. She helped Cade with every meal. She mended a torn piece of leather harness under Holt's quiet instruction with a needle and heavy wax thread, sitting close to the oil lamp in the afternoon when the light from the windows was inadequate. In the evenings they talked, not with the forced quality of people trying to fill silence, but with the natural ease of people who have agreed without ever saying, so that honesty is less exhausting than performance when you are stuck together for days with nowhere to go. Cade talked about Georgia, about a family farm that had produced cotton and then did not, about 2 older brothers who had stayed, and one younger one who had gone to St. Louis and made something of himself in a way Cade described with pride that contained no jealousy whatsoever. He talked about the westward drift that had taken him from Georgia to Tennessee, to Missouri, to Kansas, to Wyoming, each move propelled not by disaster, but by the simple restlessness of a man who needed to see what was on the other side of the next ridge. He said to Nell, "What made you answer an advertisement?" She said, "Practicality." He waited. She said, "I am educated, and I am capable, and I have been told my entire life that these qualities in a woman are admirable up to a precise point, beyond which they become inconvenient. I am 24 years old. My mother sewed until her fingers bled. I decided I would rather take a known risk than wait around for an unknown one to find me." Cade was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is the bravest thing I have heard said plainly in a long time. Most brave people dress it up. You just say it straight." She said dressing it up would not make it less true. On the 4th day, Harlan talked. It happened in the afternoon when the light through the snow-blocked windows had gone flat and gray, and the 4 of them were arranged around the fire in the companionable proximity that develops naturally between people who have shared a small space for long enough. Cade was carving something small from a piece of pine with his folding knife, his hands moving with the same careful precision he brought to cooking. Nell was reading a worn almanac she had found on the supply shelf. Holt was doing nothing visible, which she had come to understand meant he was thinking. And Harlan was looking into the fire with the expression he wore when he was building to something. He said, "I should tell you something, Miss Porter. It is relevant to your situation, and I have been deciding whether it was my place to say it." She set the almanac down. She said, "Say it." He said, "I am not a ranch hand by trade. I practiced law in St. Louis for 11 years. Estate work primarily. Wills, contracts, property transfers. I worked for Rutherford Ashworth's interests in a professional capacity for 4 of those 11 years. She said nothing. She waited. He said, "Rutherford Ashworth had a wife before you. Her name was Eleanor Voss Ashworth. She was 31 years old when she disappeared. The official record states that she died of a fever in the winter of 1891. I drew up the estate documents myself after the fact when Ashworth informed me of her death." He stopped. He looked at the fire for a moment. He said, I never saw the death certificate. Ashworth told me it had been lost. He said the local doctor who attended her had moved on before the paperwork could be completed. There were reasons given, all of them plausible, none of them quite right. I know what plausible but not quite right looks like in a document because I spent 11 years producing exactly that quality of language when clients required it. He said I began to ask questions. Quietly through the appropriate channels. I found nothing definitive. What I found was an absence, and an absence of the kind of record that death normally produces. No burial notice, no physician's report, no word from anyone in the community who had seen her ill, who had visited in her final days, who had attended the service. He said I resigned from Ashworth's employ 8 months later. Told him it was a matter of other commitments. He accepted this without objection, which was itself informative. He paused again. Something moved through his expression that he did not entirely control, a brief involuntary thing, the face of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has not yet put it down. He said there was something else. When I came to Wyoming the following spring, I did not seek work on Ashworth's ranch directly. I came through a foreman in Cheyenne who handled labor placement for several ranches in the territory, a man who did not know my history with Ashworth. By the time Ashworth learned I was on his payroll, I had been there long enough to be unremarkable. He made no move to dismiss me. I believe he found it more useful to keep me close where he could observe me than to send me away where I might speak freely. A man like Ashworth understands that proximity can serve as a leash. I came to Wyoming telling myself I wanted to see the country. I told myself a great many things. He said the truth is that I wanted to be close enough to the situation to understand it, and I have not yet understood it. Nell said, you think she did not die? Harlan looked at her directly. He said, I think that Eleanor Ashworth was an inconvenience to a powerful man who had run out of patience with inconveniences. And I think that the tools a powerful man uses to manage his inconveniences in a place where law is thin on the ground are not always the tools the law would approve of. The fire crackled. Kate had stopped carving. Holt had not moved, but the quality of his stillness had changed the stillness of a man who was listening very carefully. Nell said, and you think I am intended to be the next wife? Harlan said, I think you signed a contract that transfers certain significant legal rights over your person to a man whose previous wife is unaccounted for. Yes. She sat with this for a moment, let it settle, did not allow herself the luxury of panic because panic was what happened when you ran out of options, and she had not yet run out of options. What she had run out of was innocence about her situation, which was not the same thing and was in fact considerably more useful. She said then, I need to understand the contract. Harlan said, I read it when Ashworth's solicitor sent it for filing. I can tell you what is in it. She said, tell me. He told her, clause by clause in the measured language of a man who had spent 11 years learning to extract precision from legal documents. The obligations it imposed, the rights it transferred upon arrival and formal acknowledgement at the ranch. The one clause that she had noted without fully understanding when she signed it, the clause specifying that the contract required her voluntary acknowledgement at the point of arrival, her signature on a secondary document confirming willing acceptance of the terms. She had not yet arrived at the ranch. She had not yet signed anything beyond the original agreement. She said, so the contract is not yet in force. Harlan said that is one interpretation. The counter-argument would be that the contract binds you from the moment of signing, regardless of arrival. A court could go either way depending on the jurisdiction and the sympathies of the judge. However, he paused. He said, however, a contract that requires a subsequent act of acknowledgement, and that act has not been performed, is in several respects an incomplete instrument. There are arguments to be made. She said you could make them. He said I could. She said, would you? He looked at her for a long moment with those pale gray eyes that gave nothing away and missed nothing. He said, I drew up Ashworth's interest for 4 years. Whatever I failed to do about Eleanor, I can at least do this. She nodded, said nothing else. But something had shifted in the cabin, some redistribution of weight, as if the conversation had moved something that had been sitting in the wrong place. She was still turning this over in her mind an hour later when the horses outside went loud. Not the ordinary shifting and stamping of cold, restless animals. The sharp alarm sound of horses that have heard or smelled something they do not like. Nell looked up. Holt was already on his feet, moving to the window, clearing a small circle in the frost with the heel of his hand and looking through. He said quietly, 4 riders. He said Harlan. Harlan was already standing, already moving toward the back of the cabin. Cade said Donovan's men. Holt said 2 of them I recognize. The other 2 I do not. The knock on the door was not the knock of someone asking permission. It was the knock of someone announcing arrival. Holt looked at Nell. He said, stay behind me. Stay back from the door. She said, I understand. He opened the door. 4 men came through it without being invited. The first was large, wearing a buffalo coat with the collar turned up and a hat pulled low, his face reddened by wind and cold, and the belligerence of a man who has convinced himself in advance that he has a right to whatever he has come for. The 3 behind him ranged in age and size, but shared the quality of men who have been asked to do something and have decided not to think too carefully about what it is. The large man looked around the cabin. His eyes found Nell and stopped. He said, you would be the Ashworth woman. Nell said nothing. Holt said, what do you need, Donovan? The man looked at Holt with the calculation of someone assessing odds. He said, I need the woman. Temporarily. Until Ashworth moves his cattle off the South Fork boundary where they have been sitting since October. I have asked him politely 3 times. I am done being polite. Holt said, you are not taking her anywhere. The man said, I am not asking you, Danner. You work for Ashworth. I have a quarrel with Ashworth, not with you. Step aside and you ride out of here with no difficulty. Holt said no, just the word, flat and simple with nothing around it. He was standing at a precise angle between the door and where Nell stood near the fireplace. He had not reached for anything, and he had not raised his voice. He was simply present in the way of an object that has no intention of moving. Cade had shifted without appearing to shift, placing himself near the shelves to the right side of the group of men outside their direct line of attention. Harlan stepped forward. He said, I am going to say something and I am asking you to listen to it before anyone does anything that the next judge you encounter will find very interesting. He said it with the voice of a man accustomed to speaking in rooms where silence was required, and the quality of it, its precision, its calm, the complete absence of any emotional pleading produced exactly what he intended. The large man hesitated. Harlan said this woman is a party to a legal contract with Ashworth Ranch. She is traveling under that contract to fulfill its terms. Interference with a contracted party in transit constitutes, under the statutes applicable in this territory, a criminal act of the first order, separate from whatever civil claims you believe you hold against Ashworth regarding the South Fork boundary. Entirely separate. Whatever your quarrel with Ashworth, the law does not allow you to resolve it by laying hands on a woman who has nothing to do with where his cattle are standing in. He said furthermore, the 3 men in this room are prepared to provide detailed testimony regarding this incident to any court in Lander County or the territorial capital, including testimony regarding the names and descriptions of the parties present. He said, I suggest that your quarrel with Ashworth is best prosecuted through the appropriate legal channels, and that you take your men and return to your ranch before this situation acquires a formal record. The large man stared at him. There was recalculation happening behind his eyes, the kind that occurs when a person has prepared for a physical confrontation and encountered a verbal one and is discovering that they are not the same thing. He said, who the hell are you? Harlan said, I am a man who has spent 11 years in courtrooms and knows exactly how long a sentence runs for kidnapping a contracted party in the Wyoming Territory. The standoff lasted another 30 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Then the large man made a sound that was not quite a word turned and went back out the door. The 3 behind him followed. The door swung shut. No one moved for a moment. Then Cade let out a long, slow breath through his nose and said, Harlan, where in the hell did you learn to talk like that? Harlan said 11 years in courtrooms. Holt turned from the door. His eyes went to Nell, immediately assessing checking. She was standing straight. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and there was color in her face from something other than the fire. She said, are they gone? Holt moved to the window and cleared the frost again. Watched for a long moment. Said, riding south. She said, will they come back? He said, probably not tonight. The storm will give them an excuse to call it a reasonable decision. Come morning and clear weather, that is a different question. She said, then we may have less time than the storm was giving us. He looked at her. She said, to figure out what happens next. The evening after the Donovan men came was quieter than the ones before it, but not with the quiet of people at rest. It had the taut quality of people doing their thinking out loud in the spaces between words. They ate. They drank coffee. The fire burned. It was Cade who finally said it. He had been quiet since the confrontation, more so than usual, in a way that was different from his ordinary morning quiet. He was sitting near the fire with his hands around his coffee cup, looking at the middle distance. And after a while, Nell noticed that he was not looking at nothing. He was looking at something he had been trying to decide whether to say for a long time. She said, "Cade." He looked at her. She said, "What is it?" He said nothing. She said, "It is not nothing. It has been sitting in the room with us all evening." He looked at Holt. Holt met his gaze and held it for a moment, then looked away, which was not permission exactly, but was also not a refusal. Cade set his cup down. He said, "I need to tell you something." He said it to Nell, but he said it for all of them, the way a man says something when he is done carrying it alone. He said 2 winters ago, late January of '92. I was coming back from the North Line at night later than I had planned, maybe 2 hours after dark. I came around the east side of the main barn at the Ashworth Ranch. There was a wagon, covered. The kind they use to move things you do not want people to see. He paused, turned his cup in his hands. He said there were 2 men loading it. I did not know the men. They were not Ashworth hands. There was something in the back of the wagon wrapped in canvas, and there was a sound from it. He stopped again. Nell said a sound. He said it moved. What was in the canvas? It moved and it made a sound, not loud. The kind of sound a person makes when they have been told to be quiet and are doing their best to obey. The fire crackled. Nobody said anything. He said, I went back to the bunkhouse. I told myself I had not seen it properly. It was dark. I had been on the trail for 8 hours. I told myself a great many things, and I told myself all of them for 2 years, and none of them changed what I saw. He looked at Nell directly. He said, I did not know who it was. I did not know for certain it was what it looked like. I told myself those things too. But you are here now, and Harlan has said what he has said, and I cannot sit here and let you walk into that ranch not knowing what I know. The room was very quiet. Harlan said the timing is consistent with Eleanor's disappearance. The winter of 1891, I was told. January of 1892 is when the estate documents were finalized. Whatever Cade saw happened between those 2 dates. Cade said yes, it does. Nell looked at the fire for a long moment. She thought about Eleanor Ashworth, whom she had never met, and never would, who had been 31 years old, and had married a powerful man in a place where law was thin on the ground, and had then, by all available evidence, ceased to exist. She thought about the contract in her carpet bag, and the clause about voluntary acknowledgement, and the things Harlan had said about incomplete instruments. She thought about the $20 in her document case, and the geography between this cabin and the nearest telegraph office, and the number of days before anyone in Philadelphia would begin to wonder why they had not heard from her. She thought about a great many things, and when she had thought through them clearly and in order, she set them aside and looked up. She said, I am not going to that ranch. Nobody argued with her. On the 5th night, when Cade and Harlan had gone to their bunks and the cabin had settled into its nighttime sounds, fire and wind, and the occasional shift of weight from the horses outside, Nell sat at the window where someone had cleared a small circle in the frost and looked out at the dark. The snow had stopped. Not ended. She had learned enough in 4 days to know that was not certain yet, but paused the way a storm pauses to gather itself before continuing. The sky had cleared in a small patch directly overhead, and she could see 3 stars through it, sharp and cold and very far away. She heard the chair scrape behind her, heard the weight of Holt's footsteps. She had learned to distinguish each of them by now. Cade's light, easy stride, Harlan's measured, deliberate tread, Holt's quiet, contained movement that never used more floor than it needed. He sat down in the other chair and looked out the window with her. They sat in silence for a while. She said, I want to ask you something. He said, ask. She said, have you ever done something you knew was wrong because someone was paying you to do it? He did not answer immediately. She did not expect him to. Outside, the 3 stars sat in their small, clear patch of sky and gave no opinion on the matter. Holt looked down at his hands. They were resting on his knees. Those hands, the kind that a life of outdoor work produces, broad across the knuckles, rough across the palms, carrying the small scars of 100 minor injuries absorbed and healed and forgotten. The hands of a man who did things rather than described them. The hands of a man who had, by his own quiet accounting, ridden 1,000 miles of other people's trails in the service of other people's interest. He looked at them for a long time. Nell watched him look at them. He did not answer. But in his silence was an answer, and they both knew it. She thought about what it meant that the most honest man she had met in months was sitting across from her in a dying storm, looking at his own hands like they belonged to someone he was only now getting to know. Outside, the snow remained still. The three stars burned in their small, clear window of sky. The fire settled behind them into its low nighttime work, patient and steady and indifferent to the questions of people who sat in the dark trying to understand what they were going to do next. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. Neither of them moved. And in that stillness, something was decided between them that would not be said out loud until morning. The kind of decision that forms not in words but in the quality of the silence between two people who have stopped pretending that the situation they are in is going to resolve itself if they simply wait for the storm to end. The storm was ending. Nell could feel it. The question was what they were going to do when it did. The sixth day arrived without announcement. No dramatic shift in the wind, no sudden brightening of the sky, just a gradual quiet diminishment of sound, the way a fire goes out, not all at once, but by degrees, each degree so small you could almost miss it until you realize the roaring has been replaced by silence, and the silence has been there for a while without your noticing. Nell woke to it, lay still in her bunk, and listened for the storm, and heard instead the absence of it. The wind had dropped to occasional gusts that came and went like afterthoughts. The relentless pressure against the walls had eased. The cabin, which had spent 5 days being assaulted, sat in something approaching quiet. She got up, built the fire, made the coffee, stood at the south window, which had less snow against it than the others, and looked out at a sky that was moving from black to the deep blue that precedes dawn in high country winter. Stars still visible, air perfectly still, snow on the ground catching the starlight and giving it back as a faint, sourceless glow that made the whole landscape look like something just outside the boundary of the ordinary world. Holt was up within minutes of her. She heard him before she saw him, the quiet, contained footstep, the deliberate movement through the dark end of the cabin. He came to the window and stood beside her and looked out at the same sky. He said it is done, she said the storm. He said yes. He said it without relief, without satisfaction. He said it the way a man says a thing that is simply true and carries within its truth a set of consequences he has already begun to calculate. She said, how long before the pass is clear enough to ride? He said we could go this morning. The snow is deep but settled. The horses can manage it. She said in Ashworth. He looked at her. She said, how long before he comes? Holt was quiet for a moment. He said he will have been watching the weather from the ranch. He will know the storm broke overnight. If he moves at first light, he could be here by mid-morning with men. She said then we do not have as much time as the morning looks like it is giving us. He said no. She turned from the window. The fire was burning well now, the cabin beginning to warm in that way it did in the early hours, heat gathering in the low spaces first and rising slowly. She stood with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and looked at the 3 bunks across the room. Cade's dark shape still motionless. Harlan already stirring the way he always stirred at the first sounds of morning, as if sleep were simply a brief recess that his mind tolerated rather than required. She said, I need to talk to all of you before anything else happens. Holt said, I know, he said it quietly, with the weight of a man who has been awake in the dark for some portion of the night thinking about exactly this. By the time the sky outside had shifted from deep blue to the cold pale gray of early winter morning, all 4 of them were at the table. Coffee, the remains of Cade's biscuits from the night before, the oil lamp burning between them because the light through the windows was still not sufficient. Nell had her contract on the table in front of her. The leather document case open, the folded pages laid flat, the wax seal of the solicitor's office in Cheyenne visible at the top. She said, I want to say something before Harlan says the legal parts. She said, I understand what each of you has given up by telling me what you told me. Cade, what you saw. Harlan, what you know about Eleanor. Both of those things put you in a position with Ashworth that cannot be taken back. I am not going to pretend I do not understand that. Cade said, you do not need to. She said, I do. She said it gently but without hesitation. She said, I need to say it because it is true and because the truth of it is what I am asking you to act on. Whatever happens this morning, I want you to know that I understand the bond, and I am grateful. The table was quiet. Then Harlan reached forward and turned the contract to face him. He pulled the oil lamp slightly closer, put on a pair of small reading spectacles that she had not seen him use before, which for some reason made him look both more and less like a former judge simultaneously. He read in silence for a moment, his finger moving along the lines with the efficiency of someone who knows how to find what they are looking for in a document without reading every word. He stopped, read one section twice. He said, "Here, Clause 7, Paragraph 3. He read it aloud in the careful, measured voice of a man giving testimony. He said, "Acknowledgement of receipt and willing acceptance by the party of the second part shall be confirmed by signature of said party upon delivery to the property of the party of the first part said signature to constitute the final and binding execution of all terms herein." He looked up. He said, "Delivery to the property. You have not been delivered to the property. You have not signed the acknowledgement. Without that signature, what you have here is an agreement to form a contract, not the contract itself. The instrument is incomplete," she said, "and if Ashworth argues otherwise." Harlan said he would need to make that argument in a territorial court. That argument would require him to first explain why his ranch hands are present here rather than at the ranch. It would require him to produce correspondence about the pickup. It would require him to explain the contents of the letter he sent Danner. He paused on that, looked at Holt. Holt said, "The letter is still in my saddlebag." Harlan said, "Then we keep the letter." Nell said, "Will that be enough?" Harlan considered this in the honest way he considered everything. He said it will be enough to create substantial legal uncertainty. Whether it will be enough to stop Ashworth this morning in this location before a court has had any opportunity to weigh in, that is a different question. Ashworth does not operate primarily through the courts. He operates through the fact of his presence in the men he brings with him. The sentence settled over the table. Cade said, "So what we need is to not be here when he arrives." Harlan said, "Or to have already resolved the matter before he arrives." They looked at the contract. They looked at each other. Nell said, "What if I simply refuse? Stand in front of him and refuse to go?" Holt said, "He will not accept a refusal from you alone." She said, "From you." He looked at the table. Not at the contract, but at the grain of the wood, as if he were reading something in it. He said, "Miss Porter, there is something I should tell you before this morning goes any further." She waited. He said, "I have worked for Rutherford Ashworth for 3 seasons because the money was good and because I did not ask questions that I probably should have asked. That is the truth of it. The night Cade described with the wagon, I was not there. But there were other nights. Other things I chose not to look at directly because looking at them directly would have required me to do something about them." He said it without self-pity and without the exculpatory softening that men sometimes apply to their own failures. He said it simply as a fact about himself that had weight and deserved to be put on the table alongside everything else. He said, "I am not going to make the same choice this morning. I want you to understand that it is a choice and that I am making it not because the circumstances have made it easy, but because it is the right thing, and I have spent enough time knowing what the right thing is and doing something else." He said it to Nell, but he said it in the way of a man making a statement to himself as much as to anyone in the room. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I understand." He said, "Good." Then Harlan said, "They are coming." He had moved to the window without anyone noticing in the quiet, efficient way he moved when he was doing something that needed doing. He had cleared a circle in the frost and was looking north through it. He said, 4 riders. Coming fast." Nobody moved for exactly 1 second. Then everyone moved at once with the practiced efficiency of people who have been in close quarters long enough to know instinctively how not to be in each other's way. Cade stacked the breakfast things against the wall. Nell took the contract and folded it back into its case, which she held in her hands rather than returning to her bag. Harlan removed his spectacles. Holt went to the door and stood at it with his arms at his sides in a quality of stillness that was neither passivity nor tension, but something more deliberate than either. The riders came into the clearing in front of the cabin and stopped. Even through the walls, Nell could hear the horses, 4 of them breathing hard from a fast ride through deep snow, their hooves shifting and settling. Then one set of footsteps, one man dismounting and walking toward the door with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never had to hurry to get what he wanted, because the wanting itself has always been sufficient. The knock was 2 sharp impacts. The knock of a man who knocks is a formality rather than a request. Holt opened the door. Rutherford Ashworth was 55 years old and looked precisely what he was, which was a man who had accumulated a great deal of power in a place where power was measured in land and cattle, and the willingness to hold both against any challenge. He was not large. Medium height, lean, with the weathered compactness of a man who had worked hard in his youth and now worked at a different kind of hard thing. His coat was good wool, not rough canvas. His hat was a Stetson that had cost real money. His eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky in which there is no warmth left, and they moved around the interior of the cabin with the quick inventory of a man assessing property. They found Nell. He looked at her the way he had described her in the letter, not with cruelty, not with any visible malice, simply with the flat, assessing attention of a man looking at something he has paid for and is checking for damage. He said to Holt, "Good. She is here." He said it the way you say it about a piece of equipment you were concerned might have been lost in transit. He said, "Get her things together. We ride within the hour." Holt said no. Ashworth's eyes moved from Nell to Holt with the shift of a man who has not been told no recently enough to have a ready response to it. He said, "I beg your pardon." Holt said, "You heard me." Ashworth looked at him for a moment. Something was calculating behind those pale eyes, running the numbers on what he was seeing: the four people in the cabin, their arrangement, the quality of Holt's stillness. He said, "Danner, you have been in my employ for 3 seasons. I have paid you well and asked very little of you in return. I am asking something now. Do not make a decision in the next 30 seconds that ends badly for everyone in this room." Holt said, "I have already made it." There was a silence. Outside, the 3 riders who had stayed on their horses shifted in the cold. One of them, the eldest of the 3, a man named Aldous Pierce, who had worked the Ashworth South Range for 7 years and had eaten supper in this cabin before, and knew whose voice it was coming through the log walls, turned his horse slightly to face away from the door. Not yet a statement, but the beginning of one. Then Ashworth looked past Holt to the other 2 men. He looked at Cade with the assessment of a man recalling a face he knows but does not particularly value. His eyes moved to Harlan and stopped. Something changed in his expression. Very small, the slight tightening around the eyes, the microscopic adjustment of the jaw. The expression of a man who has walked into a room expecting to find furniture and has discovered instead that one of the chairs is a person he recognizes. He said Price. Harlan said Rutherford. The way he said the name was not warm and was not cold. It was the way a former judge says a name in a formal proceeding. Simply the name stripped of all social obligation, reduced to its function as an identifier. Ashworth said, "What are you doing here?" Harlan said the same thing I was always doing in your employ, paying attention to documents. Ashworth's eyes went to the leather case in Nell's hands. He had not looked at her as a person up to this point. He looked at the case as the thing it was, a container for a document that was either his instrument or his problem, depending on what was inside it. He said, "Miss Porter." He said her name for the first time. His voice adjusted slightly, adding a quality that was probably intended to sound like courtesy and landed as its technical approximation. He said, "I apologize for the conditions of your arrival. The storm was unforeseen. I want to assure you that the ranch is comfortable and that every arrangement has been made for your—" She said, "Mr. Ashworth." He stopped. She said it without heat and without fear. She said it the way her mother had said the names of creditors who came to the door with the absolute composed certainty of a woman who has decided precisely what she is going to say and has no intention of being moved from it. She said, "I have read the contract I signed. I have had the benefit of counsel from a man who knows its terms as well as the man who wrote them. I have not arrived at your property. I have not provided the signature of acknowledgement that Clause 7 requires for the contract to achieve full execution. By the terms of the document itself, I am not yet bound." She said, "I am not going to the Ashworth Ranch." The cabin was very quiet. Ashworth looked at her. The courtesy in his voice disappeared entirely. What remained was the flat, precise instrument of a man who has been managing people and property for 30 years and has very little patience for obstacles that present themselves in the form of women with leather document cases. He said, "You signed a contract." She said, "I signed an agreement to consider contracting. The contract itself requires an act that has not been performed. Mr. Price can explain the distinction at whatever length you require." Ashworth's eyes went back to Harlan. He said, "You have been advising her." Harlan said, I have been accurate with her. There is a distinction there as well. Ashworth said, I will take this to the territorial court. Harlan said, you are welcome to. I am available to testify, as is Mr. Calloway. I expect the court will find the testimony regarding Eleanor of some interest, given that the case was never formally closed to the satisfaction of Ashworth, said Eleanor died of a fever. He said it quickly, too quickly, with the reflexive speed of a sentence that has been repeated so many times it fires without deliberate intention. Harlan said, yes, that is what you told me. He paused. He said, Mr. Calloway has a somewhat different account of events from the January of 1892. The silence that followed was the kind that has mass, the kind you feel against your skin. Ashworth looked at Cade. Cade met his gaze without flinching. He did not speak. He did not need to. The fact of his looking back was sufficient. Something happened in the economy of the cabin in that moment. A shift in what was possible and what was no longer possible, a reordering of the weights. Ashworth was still a powerful man. He still had 3 riders outside. He still had the accumulated force of 3 decades of getting what he wanted in a territory where what you wanted and what you could take were often the same thing. But Harlan had 11 years of courts behind his eyes. Cade had what he had seen. Nell had a document and the composed certainty of a woman who had made her decision before the conversation started. And Holt was standing at the door with the quality of a man who has decided what he is willing to do and has made his peace with the consequences of it, which is the most dangerous kind of man in any room. Ashworth looked at Holt last. He said, I paid you well. Holt said you did. He reached into his coat pocket, brought out the Ashworth Ranch badge, the same small stamped metal circle Nell had seen on the coats the first morning, the mark of ownership pressed into a man's chest like a brand on livestock. He set it on the small shelf beside the door, with a sound that was almost nothing. A small dry click of metal on wood, and yet seemed to fill the cabin completely. He said, here is your property back. Cade crossed to the door without a word, set his badge beside Holt's, returned to his place. Harlan removed his from the inside of his coat and added it to the small row of metal circles on the shelf. 3 badges. 3 men who had decided each in his own way, and for his own reasons, that there were things worth more than what they had been paid. Ashworth looked at the badges for a long moment. Outside, one of the riders called in. Boss, said it with the flat urgency of a man who has seen something that requires attention. Ashworth turned and went back through the door without another word, left it open behind him. Cold air poured in. Nell moved to the window, cleared the frost with the side of her hand. Outside, the 3 riders had turned their horses to face the road south. The eldest of them, Aldous Pierce, who had worked the South Range for 7 years, had dismounted and was standing with his reins in his hand, his back to the cabin, looking at the distance. He had heard enough through the log walls. He had been around Ashworth long enough to know what a covered wagon in the night meant, and to understand now why he had never let himself think about it too directly. He said something to Ashworth. She could not hear the words, but she could hear the tone, which was not the tone of a man taking instructions. Ashworth responded. The rider shook his head. The second rider dismounted. The third, after a moment, did the same. Ashworth stood in the snow with his 3 riders standing beside, rather than behind him, and looked at the cabin with the expression of a man watching the specific, irreversible moment when something he considered an asset reclassifies itself as a liability. He turned, mounted his horse, rode south without looking back. After a moment, his 3 former riders mounted their own horses and rode south after him. Not fast, with the unhurried pace of men who are no longer in a hurry to be anywhere in particular. The sound of hooves on hard-packed snow faded. The clearing in front of the cabin went still. The cold sunlight lay across the snow in long, flat angles. The light of mid-morning in late November, thin and clear and entirely indifferent. Nell stood at the window until the last rider had disappeared into the tree line. Behind her, Cade let out a breath that seemed to have been held for approximately the last 10 minutes. He said, Lord Almighty. Harlan removed his reading spectacles and folded them into his breast pocket with the precise motion of a man completing a task he has been working toward for a long time. He said nothing, but the quality of his silence was different from his ordinary silence. Lighter, as if something he had been carrying on one side had been set down. Nell turned from the window. She looked at the 3 men. She said, thank you. Cade said, I believe you just thanked us about 6 times in one morning. She said it bears repeating. He grinned at that wide and warm the expression of a man who has come through something difficult and finds himself against all reasonable expectation on the right side of it. He said, what do you need now? She said, I need to get to Laramie. I need a telegraph office and a solicitor who did not work for Rutherford Ashworth. I need to send word to Philadelphia that I am alive and that the previous contractual arrangement is no longer operative. Harlan said, I know a solicitor in Laramie. He is honest, which narrows the field considerably, but does not eliminate it. She said, and after Laramie. Harlan said, that is your question to answer, Miss Porter. Not ours. She looked at him. She said, what are you going to do? He said, I am going to give testimony. Regarding Eleanor Ashworth and the events of January 1892. I have been deciding whether to do it for 3 years. I have decided. She said, Harlan, it will cost you. He said things that are worth doing usually do. He said it without drama, without the performative self-sacrifice of a man who wants to be seen making a noble choice. He said it as simple fact in the same voice he would use to describe the weather or the terms of a contract. The voice of a man who has spent a long time learning the difference between what is legal and what is right, and has finally late in his life decided to stop treating that difference as acceptable. She looked at Cade. He was already moving, beginning to pack with the efficient, instinctive practicality that was his natural mode in the face of any situation requiring action. He pulled down his saddlebags, packed food for the trail without being asked, doubled the portion without comment. She said, Cade. He looked up. She said, you do not have to come. He said, somebody has to make sure you eat properly between here and Laramie. He said it in the mild tone he used when he was making a decision he had no intention of revisiting. He went back to packing. She turned to Holt last. He was standing by the door where he had been for the last hour, more or less. He had put his coat back on. His saddlebags were already packed. She realized they had never been fully unpacked, as if some part of him had known from the beginning that this ending was possible, that the trail out of this cabin would lead somewhere other than the Ashworth Ranch. She said, where will you go? He said, Laramie first. After that, I have not decided. She said, you are giving up 3 seasons of wages. He said, the last 3 months will cover me well enough if I am careful. She said, I am sorry. He looked at her with an expression that she had spent 5 days learning to read and still found she could only read partially, the way you can read weather by what it shows you, but not by what is behind it, the system moving east that you can see evidence of, but cannot see directly. He said, I am not sorry. She said, no. He said, no. They began preparing to leave. Saddlebags were brought down, checks secured. The fire was banked rather than doused. Holt's decision made quietly and without explanation, the decision of a man who understood that leaving a fire burning in a way station was a courtesy to whoever came next. The 4 horses in the lean-to were saddled in the cold, the animals' breath rising in thick clouds, their hooves restless on the packed ground. There was one more thing before they left. Harlan had gone to the corner of the cabin where his personal kit was stowed. He came back to the table carrying something small in his closed hand. He had been working on it, Nell realized now, for the better part of 4 days, the object Cade had been carving at the table during the long evenings, the unidentified shape she had assumed was his own project. She had been wrong about whose hands had made it. Harlan set it on the table in front of her. It was a small carving, maybe 3 inches tall, cut from a piece of dense pine and sanded to smoothness. 3 figures standing together in an open landscape, their faces turned towards something in the distance that the carver had chosen not to show. The detail was extraordinary for such a small object, each figure distinct in posture and proportion, the ground beneath their feet rendered in careful lines that suggested the specific texture of prairie grass in winter. 3 people standing in open country, looking at whatever came next. He had not been carving it for himself. He had been making it for her. Nell looked at it for a long moment without speaking. She picked it up carefully and turned it in her hands. She said, Harlan. He said, for the days when Laramie feels too small. She looked at him. He looked back at her with those gray eyes that gave nothing away and missed nothing. And for once there was something in them that was not precision or distance, but simply the human thing. The thing that 11 years in courtrooms and 4 years of carrying Eleanor's absence had not been able to fully remove. She wrapped the carving in the handkerchief from her coat pocket and put it in the inside breast pocket of her coat close to her heart, where it would not shift during the ride. She said, thank you. He said, we should go. Outside in the clear, cold air of the Wyoming morning, the snow sat undisturbed and white and enormous in every direction, broken only by the tracks of four horses heading south, and a trail that waited patient as the hills it ran through for the people who would travel it. They left within the hour. Holt broke the trail on the steadiest horse, reading the snow conditions with the same attention he gave to everything, finding the solid ground beneath the drifts, picking the line that would cost the horses the least. Harlan rode second upright in the saddle, looking ahead with the expression of a man who has made his decision and is now simply executing it. Cade rode beside Nell and talked about nothing in particular, the quality of the winter light, the species of pine visible on the ridge to the west, the way certain kinds of cold had a smell to them that other kinds did not, in the easy way of a person who understands that sometimes company is best expressed not as profundity, but simply as presence. Nell rode in thought. She thought about the 10 miles she had walked into this situation 5 days ago, alone in a blizzard with $20, in a signed contract, in a plan that had turned out to be considerably less complete than she had believed it was. She thought about the woman she had been at the crossroads, standing in the first light snow, with her carpet bag and her stubborn refusal to acknowledge that she was in danger. She thought about Eleanor Ashworth, whom she had never met, who had been 31 years old in a winter. That was the last winter she would have in that place, and she made a private promise to Eleanor about the testimony that was coming and about making sure it arrived in the right rooms and stayed there. She thought about the three men ahead and beside her who had each made a choice this morning that would cost them something real, and who had made it with the plain directness of people who did not require the choice to be easy in order to make it. She thought about what it meant to be a woman who had come west looking for a plan and had instead found something harder to name and more valuable than any plan she could have made. By late afternoon, Laramie was visible in the distance. A scattering of buildings at a crossroads, thin lines of chimney smoke rising straight into the still, cold air, the church steeple catching the last of the day's light and throwing it back in a narrow white stripe. She said nothing when she saw it. She simply looked at it for a long time, the way you look at something you have been moving toward through difficult terrain, something you were not entirely sure you would reach, and that has now resolved from an idea into an actual place with actual streets and actual people going about their actual lives inside it. Holt pulled up beside her. He said, "There it is." She said, "Yes." He said, "What will you do?" She said, "Build something." She said it simply the way she said things when she had thought them through entirely and arrived at them cleanly without residue. She said, "I came west to build something. The thing I thought I was building turned out to be something else. I will find the right thing, and I will build that instead." He said, "You have $20 and no contract and no plan." She said, "I also have no one expecting me to be broken goods." She paused. She said, "That is worth considerably more than $20 to me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is." She said, "What about you?" He looked at Laramie. He said, "I told you I bought land north of here." She said, "You told me you were thinking about buying land north of here." He said, "I have been thinking about it for 2 years." He said, "I think I have thought about it long enough." She said, "It is late in the season to be starting a ranch." He said, "Spring is not that far." She said, "Spring in Wyoming is farther than it looks." Something happened in his expression. That almost smile, the one that occupied the territory adjacent to humor, without quite committing to it. He said, "I suppose I will need something to do in the meantime." She looked at him. She said, "Mr. Danner." He said, "You have been calling me Holt for the better part of 5 days." She said, "I have been calling you Holt in my head. I was uncertain about the rest." He said, "You can be certain about the rest." She said, "Holt." He turned to look at her. She said, "I am going to need someone who knows this country, who can read weather and ground and the behavior of people who are not telling the full truth. Someone who is good with horses." He said, "Those are fairly specific qualifications." She said, "I am a fairly specific person." He said nothing. But he did not look away, and the quality of his looking had shifted the way the quality of the light shifts in the last hour before dark, not diminishing, but changing color, becoming something warmer and more honest than the clear, cold light of midday. They rode into Laramie together, the four of them, in the last of the afternoon light. The telegraph office was on the main street between the general store and the land registry office. Nell went in while the others waited outside with the horses. She sent 2 wires. The first to her mother, 3 words, "alive and well." The second to the solicitor's office in Cheyenne, 7 words, "contract rescinded." Counsel engaged. Further correspondence to follow. She paid for the wires with two of her $20 and walked back out into the cold. Harlan was waiting. He said there is a boarding house on the next street. Mrs. Aldrich runs it. She is a woman of good sense and no unnecessary opinions. She said, "How do you know?" He said, "I stayed there when I first came to Wyoming." She asked no questions about why a former St. Louis judge was taking ranch work. I respected that considerably. She said, "Harlan." He looked at her. She said, "What you are going to do, the testimony, it will be difficult." He said, "Yes." She said, "You have been carrying this for 3 years." He said, "I have." She said, "Eleanor would have wanted someone to say it." He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that gave nothing away and missed nothing. He said, "I believe she would have." He said it quietly with the weight of a man who has been talking to a dead woman in his head for 3 years and has finally found a way to say something back to her. The boarding house was warm and clean, and Mrs. Aldrich was exactly as Harlan had described. She gave Nell the best room on the second floor, without making anything of it, showed her the wash basin mentioned, that supper was at 6 and left without asking any of the questions that were visibly present in her expression. Nell stood at the window of the room and looked out at the street below. The last of the afternoon light was going the sky above the rooftops, deepening from pale blue to the first faint purple of evening. The street was quiet, a few people moving with the purposeful hurry of people who want to be inside before full dark. She set the leather document case on the small table beside the bed. She opened it, took out the contract, and held it for a moment. Then she set it down. She would need it for the solicitor for the formal rescission for whatever legal process Harlan's testimony would set in motion regarding Eleanor. She would keep it until it had done the work it needed to do, and then she would be done with it. She reached into the breast pocket of her coat and took out the handkerchief with the carving inside it, unwrapped it carefully, set the 3 figures on the table beside the bed where she could see them. 3 people standing in open country, facing whatever came next together. She was not Mrs. Rutherford Ashworth. She was not goods in transit. She was not a woman whose value was determined by her condition upon delivery to someone else's property. She was Nell Porter of Philadelphia, 24 years old, with $18 left a room in a boarding house in Laramie, Wyoming, and the knowledge that she had walked through a blizzard and out the other side was something she had not had before, which was the precise and unambiguous understanding of what she was willing to do and what she was not, what she required, what she refused, who she was when the temperature dropped and the road disappeared and the situation became something other than the situation she had planned for. That knowledge was not nothing. In fact, it was the most useful thing she owned. Supper was venison stew and cornbread and coffee that was strong, but not Cade's level of strong, which was a standard that would take some time to let go of. The 4 of them sat at Mrs. Aldrich's table and ate without talking much, with the comfortable absence of performance that develops between people who have spent 5 days in a single room and have nothing left to prove to each other. Afterward, on the porch in the cold, Cade leaned on the railing and looked at the street and said, "I think I am going to look for work in the territory." He said it as if he were announcing a mild preference about supper rather than a decision about the direction of his life. He said, "I have been at the Ashworth Ranch too long. A man needs to work for people he can respect." She said, "You will not have any trouble finding work. Anyone who eats your biscuits will hire you immediately." He looked sideways at her with the expression of a man who is genuinely pleased but would never say so directly. He said, "That is the nicest thing anyone has said about my professional qualifications in a long time." Harlan said goodnight and went inside, moving with the purposeful deliberateness of a man who has a great deal to think through and prefers to do it horizontally. The deliberateness of a man at peace with a decision which was a different quality from the one he had been carrying for 3 years. That left Nell and Holt on the porch in the cold. She said, "There is a land registry office on this street." He said, "I saw it." She said, "It will be open in the morning." He said, "Yes." She said, "Spring is not that far." He said nothing, but she heard the slight change in his breathing that she had come to recognize as the version of laughter that does not make it all the way out. She looked up at the sky above the buildings, clear and enormous and full of stars, the kind of sky that only exists in places where there is no city light to argue with it. Cold and very far away and indifferent to the plans of the people below it, which was, she had come to understand, not a hostile quality, but simply an honest one. The sky did not care. The cold did not care. The land did not care, which meant that what happened in it was entirely up to the people standing under it. She said, Mr. Danner. He said, you have been calling me Holt for the better part of 5 days. She said, I have been calling you Holt in my head. I was uncertain about the rest. He said, you can be certain about the rest. She said, Holt. He turned to look at her. She said, I am going to build something here. She said, I do not know yet what it is, but I know what I am good at, and I know what I require, and I know that this country is large enough to do something in if you are willing to work for it and not wait for someone else to hand it to you. He said, I know that about you. He said, I knew it about you when you walked through that door half frozen and said thank you for the hospitality before you had finished shaking. She said, you remembered that. He said, I remember most things about that door opening. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the quality she had spent 5 days learning to read and still could only read partially, except that now she understood that the part she could not read was not concealment. It was simply depth. The way certain water looks dark not because it is hiding something, but because it goes down a long way. She said, the land north of here. He said, yes. She said, how much of it? He said, 300 acres along a creek. Good grass, good water. He said, room to build. She said, room for what? He said, whatever is worth building. The street was quiet around them. The cold, absolute, the stars overhead, burning with the indifferent permanence of things that existed long before the people looking at them and would exist long after. Nell stood on the porch of Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house in Laramie, Wyoming, with $18 and no contract and no plan beyond the next morning, and she understood that this was not the disaster it would have looked like to the woman standing at the Philadelphia crossroads in September, reading an advertisement in the Inquirer. This was the beginning of the actual thing. She had come west to build something real. She had walked into a blizzard and through it. She had read a letter that called her goods and decided without drama or self-pity that she was not going to be goods for anyone. She had sat at a table with 3 men in a storm-buried cabin and received the kind of honesty that most people spend their whole lives in the vicinity of without quite touching, and she had given it back in kind. Whatever came next would be hers. Not by contract, not by delivery to someone else's property. Hers because she had chosen it and worked for it and built it with a stubborn competence that her mother had called a character flaw and that she had come to understand was the most useful thing she possessed. She said goodnight to Holt Danner and went inside. 10 years later, a woman named Nell Porter ran the best small school in Lander County, Wyoming, out of a building she had designed herself and partially constructed with her own hands during the spring and summer of 1896. She had trained 4 teachers who now ran schools of their own in adjacent counties. She had testified in 2 territorial court proceedings, both of them related to the legal protection of women in contract situations. And in both cases, the outcome had gone the way that was right, rather than the way that was convenient, which is not always how these things go, but is how they went in those cases, partly because of a former judge named Harlan Price, who had a great deal to say on the subject and said it with precision and without apology. The Ashworth Ranch changed hands in 1897 after a territorial court proceeding that established sufficient cause to examine the circumstances of Eleanor Voss Ashworth's disappearance. Rutherford Ashworth relocated east under circumstances that the court did not formally describe as flight, but that bore a strong resemblance to it. The case regarding Eleanor was never fully resolved, which is the honest version of the story. Some things get close to justice without quite arriving, and the people who push them that far have to make their peace with the distance remaining. Harlan had made his peace with it. Nell knew because he had told her so 3 years ago at Christmas in the kitchen of her house, which was not the boarding house and was not far from Holt's 300 acres along the creek. He had said, I believe she knows. He had said it quietly, looking into his coffee, and Nell had not asked him what he meant because she understood exactly what he meant. Cade had found work the following spring at a cattle operation outside Cheyenne, and then another after that, and eventually a small ranch of his own in Carbon County, where he was known primarily for 2 things, the quality of his cornbread and the complete refusal of anyone who worked for him to ever be asked to do something they knew was wrong. He wrote occasionally letters that were brief and warm and always contained some observation about the weather or the horses or a particularly good cast iron pan. On a Tuesday morning in late November, the 23rd, which was the anniversary of the Stagecoach Crossroads, there was always a wildflower pressed inside the page of whatever book was sitting on the kitchen table of Nell's house. She never asked about it, and he never explained it, and they both understood what it was, a marker, a small annual acknowledgement that the day existed and mattered and had not been forgotten. On the table beside her bed there was a small carving. Three figures standing together in an open landscape, their faces turned towards something in the distance. The detail was extraordinary for such a small object, each figure distinct in posture and proportion, the ground beneath their feet rendered in careful lines that suggested the specific texture of prairie grass in winter. Three people standing in open country, looking at whatever came next. Students occasionally asked about it. She always told them it was a gift from people she had met during her first winter in Wyoming. She never elaborated. She did not need to. She knew what it was. A record of the days when she had understood finally and completely what she was made of, what she required, what she refused, the precise shape of the life she intended to live, and the equally precise shape of the life she would not. She kept it where she could see it every morning when she woke. She kept it where she could see it every night before she slept. The school she ran was not the largest in the territory, but it was considered the finest. And the women who came out of it, her students, her trained teachers, the young women who arrived in Laramie looking for something more than what they had left behind and found in Nell Porter's classroom, a woman who understood exactly that feeling went on to build things of their own. Schools and businesses and lives shaped by their own choices, rather than by the choices of men who had paid for them. Nell did not take credit for this. She understood that she had simply shown them something she had learned in a cabin during a blizzard, that the first act of building anything real is knowing what you are not willing to accept. The house she shared with Holt Danner was not far from the school, close enough that on clear mornings she could hear the children arriving, their voices carrying across the cold air, with the particular energy of young things who have not yet learned to move through the world quietly. Holt had built most of it himself over the course of 2 years, with the same economy and precision he applied to everything, no more room than was needed, no less than was comfortable constructed to last. He had built the kitchen first because she had told him that was what mattered, and he had taken her at her word, without argument, which was one of the many reasons she had taken him at his. They had married in the spring of 1896 in a small ceremony at the church on the main street of Laramie, witnessed by Harlan and Kate and Mrs. Aldrich, who had never asked any unnecessary questions and had known from the beginning that something was going to come of the two people who had stood on her porch in the cold looking at the stars. Nell had worn a dress she had made herself, blue wool, not white, because she had made her own choices about what the ceremony meant, and white had not seemed to mean the right things. The Reverend had asked if she was certain. She had said yes with the same calm directness she had used in a cabin on the sixth day of a blizzard, when she had told a powerful man that she was not going to his ranch. The Reverend had noted her tone and moved quickly to the next part of the service. On cold winter evenings when the wind came down from the mountains and pressed against the walls of the house that Holt had built, Nell would sometimes sit at the window of the kitchen and watch the snow come down, and she would not think about the crossroads or the blizzard or the contract or the cabin with the frozen door. She would think about the light in the window. The way it had looked from 50 yards out in the whiteout, a faint amber smudge, in all that white, small and distant and entirely improbable. The way she had turned toward it anyway, the way she always had. And she would think about what it means to be a woman who walks into the dark toward a light she cannot fully see, not because she is reckless and not because she is unafraid, but because she has learned the essential frontier lesson that the only lights worth anything are the ones you move toward before you know for certain what they are. She had come west with $20 in a signed contract and a plan that had turned out to be wrong in almost every particular. She had found something true instead. That was in the end a better outcome than the one she had planned for. Outside in the Wyoming dark, the snow kept falling the way it always fell in late November in the high country, unhurried, indifferent, covering everything in the same white silence, making no distinction between the roads that went somewhere and the ones that did not, leaving it entirely to the people walking on them to know the difference.